This is the Tory Leadership Election podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home.
Hello and welcome to this, the 8th episode of Conservative Home's Tory Leadership Election podcast. The editor, having reminded us that he exists, has departed once again to wherever it is that he goes. And so this is Henry Hill, and I am joined today by William Atkinson, the assistant editor of Conservative Home, and Conservative Home columnist Emily from the IEA. Hello.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. The format, as I'm sure I'm sure you're as bored of hearing this as I am of saying it, but nonetheless, for those of you who are coming to us this late, the format will be William will give us a run through of the week ahead. Then we will all three of us discuss the sort of the shape of the race, such as it is, and then William will conclude, as ever, with his much anticipated winners and losers. So, without further ado, back in his proper place, William.
Yes, thank you, Henry. I'm now returned from Lord's and I'm back on the podcast. It's very exciting, I'm sure, for all involved. Though, alas, I feel this race hasn't been overly exciting in the last few weeks. It's getting a bit dreary now, but we are, listeners, I'm sure you're pleased to hear somewhat, though, of course, Conservative Home supports the roles of party members, etc., having the vote on who's our next Prime Minister, etc., etc. But we are reaching the final hustings in this leadership election, which is in London on the 31st of August, which will be very exciting. I remember going to the last time round. It was at the Excel, and it was all very interesting. And you got to see the stump speeches in person rather than via the interweb or on television. So that's very exciting. And the day before that, Liz Truss is following Rishi Sunak's footsteps and is doing an interview with Nick Robinson, which will go out on the 30th of August at 7 p.m. on BBC One.
There we go. So those of you who are in London, which I imagine is quite a lot of you, if you fancy coming along and seeing in person what it looks like shutting a stable door once a horse is bolted, do please come along and join us. I think I'll be there. We never actually got a repeat of the Sun Showdown, did we, in the end?
No, that never actually happened. No.
I wonder. I have a few listeners, I said today, who might not remember. That was the one that was shut down when the host fainted, and they were going to restage it, but they didn't. Okay, so moving on to the main section, and I should just say, I just realised in the introduction, it's Emily Carver. Your surname is important, I think, for the purposes of the viewers. So you're not a party member, are you?
I actually am, yes.
Oh, you are?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Well,
I am yet to vote.
Well, I mean, me too. What do you we between us have done this to death, so I think William and I probably know in intimate detail what we think about this contest, but what have you made of it as someone who doesn't cover Conservative politics day to day, someone with a slightly more sort of step back view of proceedings? Do you think that it's been a good contest for the party or not?
So initially, I must say that I was one of those deeply unpopular people who thought that it was not the right time to have a leadership election. It wasn't the right time to bin Boris Johnson off, I would say. But I know that is, among some people, an unpopular opinion. Having looked at the leadership contest, having watched it to various degrees throughout, I do think that this overall is probably damaging for the party. But of course, one must give the benefit of the doubt to the winner and hope that they will be able to deal with the massive and ever-growing to-do list that they will be presented with on day one. If we look at the omni crisis that we now face, NHS, energy prices, education, waiting lists, the energy strategy as a whole, securing affordability, security of supply, getting Brexit done in a way that benefits our country. I mean, the list is endless of what the new Prime Minister will have to get done, whether they have the time to do so. I was struck today by GB News, where I present as well. They did a poll which had some results which I hope are not true, but we shall see, that the people, the British public, would prefer Keir Starmer to be Prime Minister over both Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. So that's not good. Now, at this stage, I would say that that's probably because of the economic situation that we are now in and the fact that we don't have a Prime Minister yet. So they could certainly turn that around, the Conservative Party could. But as it stands, it's going to be an uphill struggle, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I should say it's actually probably a great relief to some of our listeners to have a Boris Johnson fan on the podcast.
I wouldn't say I'm a fan.
Don't qualify.
I wouldn't
At
say
least
I'm
somebody...
a fan, and he certainly has failed. Well, I mean, if you just take energy, we're in this position arguably because we prioritised net zero and arbitrary decarbonisation targets over security of supply, over energy independence and security. So the blame does lie with Boris Johnson to a large extent on that one. So it's not that I'm a massive cheerleader for Boris Johnson, it's that I could foresee this. And it's 2 months of essentially two candidates attempting to discredit themselves, looking back at the legacy of the Conservative Party so far, the government, and essentially, again, discrediting it in many ways.
And so Conservative Home falls crushingly back into line with the suspicions of a section of our listenership, I'm sure. It's interesting. I didn't think you could hear a more damning view of the leadership contest than we've offered over the last few weeks. But you say that the two leadership candidates are trying to discredit themselves. Yes, I mean, it sounds as if, you know, you like a lot of Conservatives have taken a generally very negative view of the way this contest has played out. So let's pose a different question. What good has come of it? In your view, presumably there are some upsides, some silver linings. Has anything stood out that's impressed you or been worthwhile?
Well, I do think that the problem with these leadership campaigns, these in the run-up to the leadership election, is that because of the nature of the hustings, because of the nature of the broadcast on television and radio, it is very soundbitey. No candidate can get into in-depth policy suggestions in any meaningful way. I mean, last night at the Talk TV hustings with Julia Hartley-Brewer, very quick fire questions, quick questions from the audience. Yes, some positive suggestions. But for example, take the NHS. We have bad news about the NHS every single day. I would argue that a new Prime Minister, and perhaps this is unrealistic, should be confronting the fundamentals that are going wrong within the NHS. Rishi Sunak said he wanted radical reform last night, but the only example he gave was charging patients for missing appointments. And while that is something that needs to change, people shouldn't be not turning up to appointments. Of course, that is costly to the NHS. But is that really the crux of the problem with our health system? And Liz Truss, when she was talking about the NHS, she talked about cutting bureaucracy, but again, no specifics. So it's hard to really gauge what either candidate would be in practice when it comes to those massive issues that everyone cares about. What I would say is that Liz Truss, from my perspective, has put forward a more compelling argument on the economy. I would say that it is vitally important that we concentrate on economic growth. I don't believe that tax cuts will have this inflationary outcome that Rishi Sunak has argued. And I think that that has to be fundamentally where our government attempts to take Britain, because it is not just the pandemic that has meant that growth has slowed down. It has been stagnant for a long, long time now, or growing in an anemic way. So perhaps there's a bit of fire there with Liz Truss.
So you're leaning towards Liz? I know you haven't voted yet.
I haven't voted yet. I haven't made up my mind yet.
Fair. I mean,
there's a little bit of apathy there, if I may admit that.
Yeah, I mean, I left my ballot paper at a friend's house, and I simply have not gone and retrieved it. And I do need to remember to vote because it is important. But
I would say my Conservative membership is something that I've had since I was perhaps in sixth form, and I've just let it keep going. Whether I continue to do so, I don't know.
I joined in Freshers Week, tragically uncool, tragically uncool as I was.
If you think that's uncool, to be fair, I joined when I was 15, so I have been a member of the Tory Party.
That doesn't surprise me, William.
William Atkinson shifting the Overton window of social embarrassment to my advantage again.
I would say on the Overton window, we are in quite a dangerous situation right now where all the solutions to the energy crisis that are popular with the public are left-wing solutions. So we've heard so much about nationalisation of key industries, including the energy sector. We've heard about the fact that greedy corporates are to blame for inflation, and that is something that sounds appealing to people to believe. We've also heard, how tax cuts are akin to handouts, this sort of manipulation of words. And the problem is people are looking at the Conservatives and they're looking at Labour. Labour has this proposal, however economically illiterate I believe it to be, that is freezing energy bills, paying for it with yet another windfall tax on the energy and oil companies. But it's a proposal and the public wants something done. So it's how does the new leader balance reality, i.e. we can't change the wholesale cost of energy instantly. We can help by increasing supply in this country and going to other countries, et cetera, et cetera. But how do they balance that reality with also looking like they care and looking like they're going to help out people, particularly at the bottom? So it's very difficult. I do not envy their job.
No, it's going to be absolutely horrifying. And of course, without subsidising demand, which is what Labour's plan would do, because
exactly.
The price mechanism simply didn't apply and everyone would keep using just as much energy as now.
Exactly. And you've seen people on the right start advocating for rent controls in one way or another, which again is shocking. When have any type of price control ever worked?
No, I mean, yeah, absolutely, it is bizarre, and it's testament really to the lack of thinking on many parts of the right. I want to circle back to what you said about the NHS, because obviously the NHS is one of the biggest challenges, long-term structural challenges. But the new leader is going to be in a very difficult position because, one, the Conservatives generally are not trusted on the NHS. I think this is very one of those Nixon to China things. It's probably going to be something that Labour fixes at some point. Tony Blair actually tried in 2007. But the other problem is, the Conservatives were elected in 2019 on a manifesto. Obviously, that manifesto reflected completely different economic and geopolitical conditions. But it is nonetheless the manifesto which they have a mandate for in the Commons. And I think this is particularly going to be a problem for Liz Truss, given that she represents a bigger break with Johnsonism. She doesn't have a mandate. She doesn't have a specific mandate for the tax cuts, although she can probably get those through. But she certainly wouldn't have a mandate for massive structural reform to the NHS. And so that would necessitate, do you think that would necessitate an election to try and take on those issues? And is that realistic when the party is 15 points behind in the polls?
Yes, the situation does lend itself to a continuity candidate if you're not immediately going to have a general election. But I do think that on the NHS, it's one of those things that when you're speaking to a think tank or you're at a private dinner or that sort of event, you can talk about how we could move to a social insurance model like Germany, or move to a Swiss model or an Australian model in terms of the way we fund the NHS. In practice, I don't see that happening because there isn't the will. There are so many vested interests. The doctors and nurses who are already, threatening to strike. It would be hugely, hugely damaging and would not be able to be done damaging to the Conservative Party, and wouldn't be able to be done in the short period of time that the Conservative Party have left till the next general election. So it's one of those things that, and now I'm not an expert on the minutiae of how the NHS runs day to day. But I do think the ambition to cut bureaucracy is one that needs to be done. I was speaking to a GP today with 30 years experience, and he was saying how the key thing that's going wrong is workforce planning. And that's something that some of my family are doctors, and it's something that they would echo, certainly, is that the workforce planning just isn't there.
What does that mean?
Why are we lacking GPs? Why are we lacking doctors? Why are we lacking nurses? Why aren't we looking ahead?
Yeah, I would come back on both those points, because I think actually something that...
But that's a failure of central planning, and I would argue that's a failure of any state.
It's just another way.
The number of medical places there are, for example. Why do we cap them? Why do we cap student numbers?
So apparently it's because of the cost.
Right.
The cost of training up doctors obviously is hugely expensive compared to someone studying an English literature degree or a French and German one like I did.
Okay.
I think that's the issue, because I don't see how it would be protecting the qualification, particularly if there's a huge demand for doctors and nurses. I may be wrong on that, but I believe it's because of the cost. Same with dentists.
Yeah, it was complete. I think it's complete short-termism. It's just based on basically this economic model that it's expensive to train up doctors. So what we can forever do into the future is just import ones from other parts of the world. But of course, one of the objectives underlying Brexit was, yes, the government has said it wants to make sure that lots of talented people can come from all the world to stuff and do all the jobs that we're not actually prepared to do or haven't actually planned to have people do in this country. But on the other hand, we actually have to have some thinking, as Emily says, for actually, if we're going to have this centrally planned model of healthcare, then you actually have to think, and that was the whole idea behind institutions like the NHS, which is that the man in Whitehall knows best, or woman, so that they can plan years in advance and work out what the NHS actually is. But that never actually works in practice because people need to cut a bit of money so they can give a bit of money here and a budget, etc. And it never actually works out properly. But I would come back on the point that both of you made there about the Tories not being trusted on the NHS. One of the most interesting things in polling over the last few years, which developed especially after the referendum, especially with Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, and with the changes of the Tories from the sort of austerity model of economics that we had under Cameron Osborne to the higher spending model that we had under May and Johnson, was that the Tories actually became increasingly trusted on the NHS, according to polling. There are actually points when they pulled ahead of Labour, and especially both May and her pomp and then Johnson in 2019, early 2020, were more trusted on the NHS than Labour were. And what that should have been used to have done is that the Tories should have thought, sort of in terms of 10, 20 years, of how that could actually be mobilised, a bit like Thatcher dealing with the economy in the first government, privatisations in the second, then sort of social reforms, etc. in the third. That the Tories should have drawn parity with Labour, become trusted on the NHS in the first term of the Johnson government, and then moved on in their second term to actually trying to implement some meaningful reforms. But of course, because nobody in the Tory party actually understands any sort of basic idea about political strategy and how to actually plan to do or achieve things in government, all of that was wasted, and we're now back at the start.
I would say Liz Truss did talk about empowering doctors and the front line. So that was good, at least in terms of rhetoric. It did massively bother me, this week's intervention from Rishi Sunak on lockdown and the lack of cost-benefit analysis, which was something I and many others were calling out for. Where is the cost-benefit analysis for continued lockdowns? And for him to come out at this stage, I do wonder what the motive was there. Was it pre-planned? Had he wanted to say this for a long time? Was it a last-ditch attempt to get those who had been lockdown skeptics on his side within the Conservative Party? Is it to prepare himself for whatever he does next? I don't know. But I did find that stuck in the craw a little bit for me, because I would say, well, where were you then?
I think it's unfortunate, given the importance of the subject, that Rishi's intervention comes in a context where he has been quite desperately pandering to the right of the Tory party for several weeks.
Exactly.
Because it means that what should be a very important intervention from somebody who was at the top of the government and had a first-hand view, you put it together with, I'm not going to let anyone build on the green belt and I'm going to put people on prison ships. And you're like, do you really believe any of this? Well, I think that's been a sort of wonderful canter through the contest so far. We've only got a week, is it, to go? 2 weeks?
Yeah.
So in our last 5 minutes, we're going to go back to William, and William is going to give us the winners and losers.
Yes, so I think my winner for this week obviously has to be Boris Johnson, for two major reasons. Firstly, we've got a poll from YouGov that suggests 49% of Tory members would choose Boris over either Truss or Sunak put together, and that was also so 49%, of Tory voters would choose Boris, and then the actual figure when you put, as a choice between the three of them, when you actually put the figures for both Truss and Sunak together, didn't even match up to that 49%, which I think is in itself remarkable. And then the Times also ran several splashes on some focus groups they'd done with voters in sort of swing constituencies, where they found that they would much prefer Boris than either of the candidates as well. And I think, Dominic Sandbrook had an excellent article on this about on Unheard this morning about it. I mean, we've both written about it at different points, that there is this sort of emerging, missing sort of Johnson movement, where people are sort of talking about, as Emily was earlier, that this leadership contest was unnecessary, and that Boris, for all his faults, at least, was the Heineken politician who could, I wouldn't say touch parts of the electorate, but could reach parts of the electorate that others couldn't quite. And I think at this point we've got to the stage where nobody can remember who Chris Pincher was. Wakefield, Tiverton and Honiton are just places on a map. And I think Tory party members who feel disillusioned after seeing the two contestants going at it hammer and tongs over the last few weeks would much prefer if we just stuck with the original candidate. And I think as well as again we've all said, is that Boris has already started shaping this narrative that he is this political giant who gets the big decisions right, who's been brought down by these pygmies, and he's going to go off to the Telegraph or wherever else and keep furnishing this narrative. Hope that a Liz Truss government, assuming, of course, she does become Prime Minister, as all the polls say she will, self-destructs, and then he'll be back in Downing Street within the next 12 months. Unlikely? Very much so. Is it what I think the Johnsonites are pushing for? Quite possibly.
Cool.
And then who's had a bad week?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say, and this is perhaps a subject close to your specialisms than mine, Henry, but nevertheless, I would say who's had a bad week is the people of Denmark. Because today Nicola Sturgeon is in Copenhagen to open an outreach sort of centre by the Scottish government, the Scottish executive as it should be, to basically continue her efforts to run a foreign policy on the sly from Holyrood, and also just to promote her ludicrous fantasy of Scottish independence. And so already the people of England, Scotland, Wales, the Northern Ireland, the United Kingdom, the awesome foursome, have had to get used to 7 odd years, or even longer actually at this point, much longer if you're in Scotland, of Nicola Sturgeon's tedious braying about her pointless little political project. But now the people of Denmark, everybody's favourite social democracy and haven for Vikings, have to put up with that too. So as I say, our deepest solidarity here from ConHome to the people of Denmark for having to endure this awful fate too.
Oh, well, there we go. I was wondering what on earth Denmark had to do with my particular areas of expertise. But there we go. Although obviously social democracy, but also in so many ways one of the most right-wing countries in the world.
Their immigration system is... Yeah.
Absolutely. Slightly terrifying. Well, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you both for joining me. Emily especially, thank you for stepping in.
Thank you.
The Andrew Jimson par excellence. Next week, I'm going to give up guessing. I have no idea who will constitute the panel next week.
Finally, we'll have Taylor Swift. Finally, we'll have Taylor Swift.
The editor will be here or not. I will presumably be here because I have nowhere else to be. William might be here. But thank you, as ever, for joining us and putting up with us for 20 minutes. And we will tune in again next week.